The Fashoda Incident in 1898 was the last time that Britain and France nearly went to war. And incredibly, it was all about a tiny fort in a pest-ridden swamp in South Sudan during the European colonial scramble for Africa. Tensions rose to fever pitch, with the press in both countries calling for war, talk of the French army getting ready to invade England, and the Royal Navy actually being ordered onto a war footing. It's one of those what-if alternative history scenarios, but at the time, the threat of it spiralling out of control was all too real. This is the often forgotten story of the Fashoda Incident, and how Britain and France almost went to war. Tensions between Britain and France in the region had been simmering for well over a decade, since the British had de facto taken control of Egypt. Ever since Napoleon's invasion, France had considered Egypt to be in her sphere of influence. And in the 1860s and 70s, the French had helped the Egyptian Khedive attempt to modernise his country. Boulevards, complete with Parisian-style buildings, had been constructed in Cairo and Alexandria, and Egyptian army officers trained by the French. The French had even gone in 50-50 with the Khedive to fund the construction of the Suez Canal. This new maritime superhighway to India and the Far East had attracted the interest of the British. In 1875, with the Egyptian exchequer bankrupt thanks to the Khedive's ambitious modernisation projects, the British bought out his share in the canal. In 1882, a nationalist uprising led by Egyptian army officer Urabi Pasha broke out. Whilst the French pondered how to deal with this situation, the British sent in an expeditionary force under General Sir Garnet Wolseley, crushed the revolt, and effectively took over the country. The French were aghast that their old rival, perfidious Albion, had wrong-footed and sidelined them. And whilst unable to eject the British, the French looked for opportunities to somehow settle the score. The economic lifeline of Egypt has always been the River Nile. By the time it reaches Egypt, it is one mighty river, but it's actually formed by two rivers joining together at Khartoum in Sudan. The Blue Nile that rises in Ethiopia, and the bigger and more powerful White Nile that rises in Central Africa. In 1893, Frenchman Victor Prompt advocated controlling the source of the White Nile. In other words, if the French could grab land further up the Nile, and dam it, they would turn the Nile on and off like a tap down in British-controlled Egypt. His idea was eagerly picked up by the colonial lobby in France. Not only would controlling the White Nile put the British in Egypt potentially at their mercy, it would also help build a French empire stretching all the way across Africa, from their colonies in the west to their colony of French Somaliland in the east. It also had one additional benefit. Down in South Africa, British imperialist Cecil Rhodes was advocating a railway running from Cape to Cairo, travelling all the way through British territory. If the French could establish their West-East Empire first, they would block that British ambition. So, a sort of win-win-win for the French. All they had to do was somehow grab it before anybody else did. Actually, someone did already have it. The independent Islamic State of Sudan. Originally controlled by Egypt, the Sudanese had revolted in the early 1880s under the Mahdi. I've told a few stories about the Mahdist revolt and how British General Charles Gordon, on loan to the Egyptians, ended up besieged in Khartoum, and how the British Army was sent in an unsuccessful attempt to rescue him. Check out the links in the description below. With the death of Gordon in Khartoum, the British quietly withdrew, and for the next 14 years, Sudan, ruled by the Mahdi's successor, the Khalifa, managed to avoid being swallowed up by the European powers in the scramble for Africa. All the French had to do was wrest control from the fearsome Mahdist warriors. Oh, and actually get all the way to the river in the first place. The race was on. In 1896, a 150-man-strong French expedition set out from Libreville in modern-day Gabon on a 2,500-mile journey up the Congo River and through the little explored jungles of Central Africa. Led by 34-year-old Major Jean-Baptiste Marchand, its goal was a ruined fort on the banks of the White Nile, Fashoda. Marchand had enlisted in the army in 1883. Promoted from the ranks, he had transferred to the French colonial army in Senegal, West Africa. Whilst officially an exploration expedition, the fact that his force consisted almost entirely of black Senegalese soldiers and French officers made it obvious what its real purpose was. And the British took note. Nevertheless, to travel over 2,000 miles through Africa in the 1890s was no mean feat, whatever the real objective, especially when his men had to drag their metal boat for over 200 miles through the jungle. Eventually, after a 2-year journey, on Sunday the 10th of July 1898, Marchand reached Fashoda. They found the old fort, built by Charles Gordon, in ruins, with no sign of life, except for snakes and scorpions. The French officer hoisted the tricolour and claimed the fort on behalf of France. At this momentous moment, the flagpole snapped. Marchand then set about making the fort into a defensive location once more. In its heyday, the Egyptian fort consisted of 2,000 metres of fortified walls and a garrison of 800 men. With a fraction of those men, 6 French officers, 2 white NCOs, 98 Senegalese and 10 boatmen, he reduced the fort to just 35 metres square, plus an outer perimeter. He then made contact with the leader of the local Shilluk people. The Frenchman argued that as the Egyptians had abandoned them during the Mahdist revolt, and as they were not Muslims, they owed the Khalifa no allegiance. Consequently, they were an independent people, and he convinced the leader to sign a treaty placing himself under French protection. The French Empire was growing. But not if the Khalifa had anything to do with it. Early in the morning on the 25th of August, 2 armour-plated gunboats with cannon, pulling small boats behind them, which contained over 1,000 Mahdist warriors, appeared on the river. Despite the gunboats bombarding the French positions, about a third of the Mahdist shells failed to explode. Having delivered their ineffective barrage, the Sudanese vessels continued upriver. Marchand now decided to take the initiative and led part of his force out to fire at them. The accurate rifle fire of his Senegalese troops caused panic in the little boats, where the Mahdist warriors became sitting ducks. Turning around, the gunboats once more passed Fashoda, firing as ineffectively as before, and then retreated downstream in the middle of the afternoon. Marchand had lost just 5 men wounded. No numbers were ever obtained as to the Sudanese Mahdist losses, but the French had fired 14,000 rounds of ammunition, a third of their supply. 5 days later, 30th of August, the Khalifa's men resumed their attack on Fashoda. This time the gunboats were left behind, and the warriors attacked on foot. Fortunately for the French, just as the attack began, their own gunboat, which they'd pulled for over 200 miles through the African jungles, arrived with reinforcements. With this sudden change of events, the Mahdists withdrew. But having expended over a third of their ammunition, how could Marchand's small force of just over 120 men continue to fend off the Khalifa's attacks? Little did the French commander know that the Khalifa had bigger problems on his mind. His attention had turned to the north, where an Anglo-Egyptian army under General Herbert Kitchener was marching on his capital at Omdurman. Aged 48, Kitchener was the Sirdar or Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian army. Fluent in Arabic, he had served in the Middle East for over 20 years, first surveying in Palestine before being seconded to the Egyptian army. He'd participated in the unsuccessful Gordon Relief Expedition and was keen to avenge the death of his fellow Royal Engineer and personal hero. In 1896, the very year that Marchand had set out on his expedition, the British government agreed that Kitchener could advance with his Egyptian army as far as Berber in Sudan. Kitchener telegraphed London requesting a brigade of British troops to augment his force as it faced the Mahdist army. And with those British reinforcements, Kitchener continued his advance, captured Berber, and then defeated the Khalifa's army at the Battle of Atbara. He now requested a second British brigade and permission to advance on the Khalifa's capital at Omdurman across the Nile from Khartoum. Those troops duly arrived, along with an envelope containing sealed orders for Kitchener. This envelope was to be opened only when Khartoum had been captured. On the 2nd of September 1898, just 3 days after Marchand had fended off that second Mahdist attack, his joint British-Egyptian army of 25,000 men and 100 guns devastated the Khalifa's army at the Battle of Omdurman. The following day, he crossed to Khartoum, where in the grounds of Gordon's derelict palace, a Thanksgiving service was held. Gordon had been avenged. And later that day, he opened his sealed orders. Meanwhile, nearly 300 miles to the south of Khartoum, Marchand and his tiny garrison were awaiting the next assault from the Mahdists. 2 weeks after the Battle of Omdurman, local tribesmen, covered in sweat, arrived at his fort with alarming news. A huge Mahdist force, consisting of 5 steel gunboats and thousands of warriors, had been seen heading up the river towards Fashoda. Marchand immediately ordered his garrison to stand to. They waited at their posts all day, and through the following night. The next morning, 18th of September, 2 Sudanese soldiers from the Egyptian army wearing red hats and khaki drill arrived outside the fort. Saluting the French commander, they presented him with a letter addressed to Chief of the European Expedition at Fashoda. It was from Kitchener. Back on the 3rd of September, Kitchener had opened his sealed orders. Thanks to the 19th century communications, no one actually knew where Marchand was, but the British government were taking no chances. Kitchener was now ordered to proceed up the White Nile and secure it for Britain. If he met the French, he was to use his initiative to convince them that their presence was an infringement of the rights of both Britain and the Khedive of Egypt, whose territory Sudan had originally been prior to the Mahdist revolt. Under no circumstances was he to open fire, but he could intimidate the French to leave with a massive show of force. Kitchener therefore set off with 5 gunboats, a company of Cameroon Highlanders, 2 battalions of Sudanese infantry from the Egyptian army, battery of artillery, and 4 machine guns. Actually, he wasn't setting out completely blind. By chance, shortly after the fall of Omdurman, one of the gunboats from the 25th of August battle at Fashoda had arrived back at the city. It was only after they docked that they discovered that the Khalifa had fled and they were surrounded by British soldiers. Upon questioning, they confirmed that there were black troops at Fashoda and some white soldiers. The captain of the gunboat showed bullet holes in his vessel, some of which still contained bullets, and those bullets looked European. But which European? After all, it could be the French. But it could also be an expedition that had been sent by King Leopold of the Belgians from the Congo. And it wasn't beyond the realms. It might even be the Italians from their colony in Eritrea on the Red Sea. The captain wasn't sure. After all, he said, all Europeans looked alike to him. Hence why Kitchener addressed his letter, the one handed to Marchand, to the chief of the European expedition at Fashoda. As he approached Fashoda, Kitchener was met by a rowing boat containing some of Marchand's Senegalese soldiers, who presented him with a return letter from Marchand. In it, the French officer congratulated Kitchener on his victory and welcomed him to Fashoda in the name of France. He signed himself Commissioner of the French government over the Upper Nile. Well, at least Kitchener now knew who he was dealing with. By 10 a.m, Kitchener's flotilla had sailed into view, with their gun ports open, manned, and pointing at the French fort. On the decks were 1,500 British and Egyptian army troops, fresh from the Battle of Omdurman. In contrast, Marchand's force consisted of 120 Senegalese troops armed with modern repeating rifles, commanded by French officers and NCOs. Also at the fort were some local tribesmen armed with spears. It wasn't exactly an equal face-off. Half an hour later, Marchand came aboard Kitchener's gunboat. A Francophile, Kitchener, who had actually served with the French ambulance during the Franco-Prussian War, conducted the negotiations with Marchand in French. Kitchener said that his army had defeated the Khalifa, and all of Sudan, including Fashoda, was jointly British and Egyptian by right of conquest. Marchand countered by stating that as the Egyptians had abandoned the area in the 1880s, they had abdicated their rights to it. The local people were independent of the Mahdist regime, and anyway, he had arrived before the British. Kitchener responded that whatever the finer points, the French commander needed to consider the predominance of the force at Kitchener's disposal. The Frenchman politely explained that until he received an order from his government to retire, he and his men were willing to die at their posts. He'd called Kitchener's bluff. So the British general said that for the time being, he would not force Marchand to retire or take down the French flag. Marchand, for his part, agreed that the Egyptian flag could be hoisted, but not the Union flag, and a garrison of Egyptian soldiers from their Sudanese battalions established. And with those formalities achieved, the two men sat down to drink British whiskey and French champagne. With his 600 Sudanese troops now ashore and camped close to the French, Kitchener departed back downstream, but not before presenting another letter, officially protesting at Marchand's presence on Egyptian and British soil. British passive-aggressive behaviour at its best. Once back in Khartoum, he sent a telegram to the British Foreign Office with his news. It arrived in London on the 25th of September. Whilst the confrontation between Kitchener and Marchand had been civil and no shots were fired in anger, the news when it arrived in London and Paris caused a metaphorical explosion. British politicians and the press were incensed that after the sacrifices made to defeat the Mahdists and the fact that Kitchener had convincingly smashed the Khalifa's army, the French were trying to steal the spoils of victory from under their nose. The Times thundered on the 27th of September that we cannot allow others to reap the achievements of the victory, and accused the French of being unsporting and underhand. The French, on the other hand, had a different viewpoint. They celebrated the incredible physical achievement of Marchand marching 2,000 miles to Fashoda, and rather like the commander himself, they argued that they'd occupied virgin territory, something the locals might have disputed. Moreover, here was yet another example of their old enemy throwing their weight around. The British had lost the race to control the headwaters of the White Nile. Fashoda was French, and there should be no backing down. Parisian newspaper Le Matin summed up many Frenchmen's feelings, boldly proclaiming, "No is the only response worthy of France." Suddenly the papers on both sides of the Channel were talking about war. Tensions escalated at an alarming speed. The British Chargé d'Affaires in Paris, Colonel Dawson, reported that he had it on good authority that 5 French army corps were under orders to prepare to invade England. Furthermore, several French admirals were bragging that England need not count on a speedy termination to the war. Maybe the French military were motivated to defend the honour of France in faraway Sudan. But maybe they were motivated by events much closer to home. Even without a possible war with Britain, the French Third Republic was in turmoil. Industrial unrest had resulted in troops being deployed on the streets, whilst the Dreyfus affair had split the country down the middle. The affair itself saw Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer, accused and convicted of treason, spying for the Germans. When evidence was presented of his innocence and identifying the real spy, the French army, in a decidedly anti-Semitic stance, simply brushed it under the carpet. A public outcry on behalf of Dreyfus was fronted by, amongst others, future World War I leader Georges Clemenceau. Meanwhile, the right were rallying behind the French army. Fashoda could be an opportunity to deflect these internal divisions externally instead. And where better to focus those energies but on France's old enemy, England? Colonel Dawson in Paris was concerned by rumours that he had heard that some French generals were going to use the Fashoda Incident to stage a coup. And if that happened, the slide towards war would be accelerated. Over in London, the British government took his concerns so seriously that he was ordered to take the cross-channel ferry every evening to report on the latest situation. On the 26th of October, Marchand's second-in-command arrived to a hero's reception in Paris. 7,000 cheering nationalists met him at the Gare de Lyon station with shouts of "Vive l'Armée!" and "We will stay at Fashoda." Over the next couple of days, he met the French Foreign Minister, Théophile Delcassé, and urged him to stand up to Britain. On the 28th of August, the French imperialist magazine, La Dépêche Coloniale, demanded war rather than submit to the humiliation of recalling Marchand. Back in September, Marchand had gone toe-to-toe with Kitchener and called his bluff, daring him to use force. Now it was the time for the British to call the French bluff. On the very same day that La Dépêche Coloniale was advocating war, the British cabinet met for a crisis meeting. The mood of that meeting in London was intense. The Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Goshen, advocated a preemptive strike on the French fleet in the Mediterranean. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury urged caution, but found that the majority of his colleagues, whilst not advocating immediate hostilities, were keen on a show of force. That very afternoon, an order was sent to the Mediterranean fleet to mobilise. The following day, the Channel Fleet was ordered to Gibraltar. The French bluff had been called. President IV of France took a reality check. Despite all that bombastic talk of fighting for French honour, the President, and many in the military, realised that without any land borders, a war with Britain would be fought at sea. And at sea, the Royal Navy was supreme. The only way the French could hope to equal numbers, if not quality, on the ocean was if their allies Russia joined them. But the Russian Tsar informed the President that their alliance was limited to confrontations starting in Europe, and they were under no obligation to aid France in a dispute in a swamp in Sudan. Moreover, their fleet in the Baltic was already being frozen in its ports. And the same internal divisions within France that some on the right were hoping that Fashoda would heal cut two ways. The fact was, the President was being asked to lead a deeply divided country into a war with Britain, and divided countries don't tend to win wars. For the President, the mobilisation of the British Navy settled the issue. He formed a new cabinet on the 1st of November, and 2 days later agreed to recall Marchand. That evening, Lord Salisbury announced the French climbdown in a speech at the Guildhall in London, to huge applause. Britain had faced down her historic enemy and won, without even firing a shot. Marchand finally evacuated Fashoda on the 10th of December 1898, 2 weeks after his 35th birthday. He refused to travel through British-controlled Sudan and Egypt, and instead made his way to French Somaliland via Ethiopia. And so he had indeed marched all the way across Africa, a heck of a physical endeavour, but it was all for naught. Britain controlled the White Nile, the French had no leverage over Egypt, and hopes for a French empire stretching west to east across Africa lay in tatters. Marchand's arrival in France in the summer of 1899 was muted. By then, the French government was keen to put the previous year's events firmly behind them. Major Marchand later served in the French army sent to China during the Boxer Rebellion, and later still in the First World War, where he was wounded twice in action. He died in 1934 in Paris from the effects of those wounds, aged 70. He never forgave the British for thwarting his expedition to Fashoda. Nor did many other French men and women. A lingering distrust and resentment against the British continued for decades to come, playing a direct role in French-British relations in the Middle East during and after World War I, the results of which still shape the region to this day. Looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the Fashoda Incident seems almost surreal. A standoff in the swampland of southern Sudan potentially resulting in a war between Great Britain and France. But could it have really happened? And if so, what would have been the result? It's one of those what-if history discussions. Maybe I should host a live show so you can share your thoughts. What do you think? Write a comment below. My opinion, for what it's worth, is that a battle at Fashoda itself would almost certainly have led to Marchand's defeat. Whilst Marchand believed that his Senegalese troops were more than a match for the Egyptian Sudanese battalion camped nearby, the latter troops had fought highly effective battles at both Atbara and Omdurman, so his assessment might have been a bit wide of the mark, not to mention that they outnumbered and outgunned his men. Nevertheless, had Marchand initially been successful, he was stuck miles from any support, and Kitchener would have returned with more men and gunboats. It's also hard to see how a naval confrontation would have resulted in anything other than a victory for the Royal Navy. Certainly that was the view of the French president. But here's another potential outcome, and it was one that French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse was concerned about. Would Germany have used the chaos of the war to assert herself against France, maybe even allying with Britain? For Delcasse, Germany, not Great Britain, was the real threat. Indeed, he was so anti-German that Kaiser Wilhelm described him as the most dangerous man for Germany in France. And in a way, he proved to be just that. Because the Fashoda Incident convinced Delcasse that Russia was not the reliable ally France had thought. To protect France from Germany, they needed an even more powerful ally. And so it was that just 6 years later, the French foreign minister was instrumental in establishing the Entente Cordiale with Britain. The Fashoda Incident was conveniently and quietly forgotten. Indeed, the name Fashoda itself disappeared from the map, as it was renamed Kodok. And that remains the name of the town of 7,000 people in South Sudan to this day. 10 years after the Entente Cordiale, France and the United Kingdom would stand side by side against Germany in the First World War. So in a slightly bizarre way, maybe that coming together of France and Great Britain is the real legacy of the Fashoda Incident. Find out more about Kitchener's victory at the Battle of Omdurman by watching my video. A link's appearing, well, about now. Please like, share and comment, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And finally, a big thanks to Mark, Rob, Christine and George for your support. Details of how to support the show are in the description. Thanks for joining me today, keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.